Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our final plenary session of the day for Advocacy Week. It may be the final session, but it's certainly one of the most important ones on holding Israel accountable. My name is Ayah Ziyadeh, and I am AGP Action's Advocacy Director, and I'm so happy to be joined by you all today. As we all may agree on here, the US government has a responsibility to hold Israel accountable for how it uses US military funding, as well as how it treats American citizens. And yet, despite the Israeli government's use of US military funding to commit war crimes, its murder of 2 Palestinian Americans this year alone, and its systematic treatment of American citizens of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim background at the borders that it controls, the United States has done nothing but turn a blind eye to these crimes and continued to reward Israel with special privileges. This panel is going to explore the ways that we are looking to change that. So today I'm joined by 3 amazing panelists. Our first being Lina Abu Akleh. She's the niece of the late Israeli murdered Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She holds a BA in Political Studies and an MA in International Studies with a concentration in human rights. For the past 4 months, Lina has been advocating for justice and accountability for the murder of her aunt. We also have with us Diana Buttu. She's a lawyer specializing in negotiations, international law, and international human rights law. She was also a former legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and was the only female negotiator during her 5-year tenure. She's also policy advisor to Al-Shabak, the Palestinian Policy Network, and she was recently a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Last but not least, we have with us Josh Ruebner, who's the Director of Government Relations with the Institute for Middle East Understanding. He's also an adjunct lecturer in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C., and is pursuing his PhD at the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know you all have very busy schedules, continuously advocating for Palestine. So I'm going to jump into our first question for Lina. Lina, the Biden administration seems to be stuck in a disappointing posture of never questioning Israel. If your aunt had the chance for a direct conversation with President Biden, what do you imagine she would say to him?
Thank you, Ayah, and thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for having me. If my aunt was to meet with Biden, she would tell him the same things we've been saying for the past 4 months. She would call on the same things that we have been calling on for the past several months now. You know, throughout her entire career, Shireen was saying the same things. She was calling for justice, calling for peace, and calling for accountability for the countless Palestinian citizens who've been murdered. But having the chance to directly speak to Biden, I think she would have told him the same thing we have, which is to treat Palestinian American citizens equally and the impunity, and most importantly, to ensure that Palestinian American citizens are treated equally and they receive the same rights as American citizens do abroad. For the past 4 months now, we've been trying to seek justice for the killing of my aunt, going from one state to another, going from one country to another, calling for justice, and trying any and all avenues that we have to hold the Israeli soldier, the Israeli army, and the chain of command and the government that is responsible for the killing of my aunt. And until today, the Biden administration has failed time and time again to open an investigation. It's the least that they can do. And this is what my aunt would have also asked for him. to open an investigation, an FBI investigation, as they would do when a citizen is killed abroad in another country. But only because she's a Palestinian American citizen, then the rights applied to her differ. And there's an issue of bias, hypocrisy, and double standards. And I always say this: if she was killed in another country under another army, the situation would have been completely different. It's simple. All that we're asking for is an investigation, an independent investigation that holds the Israeli army responsible and accountable. I mean, we all know the facts. We all know what happened that day. And especially today, we had a report released by the Al Haq organization. It was a detailed video that remodeled or recreated the scene from the day Shireen was targeted along with her colleagues. And it clearly showed that they were targeting her upper body. They were, the sniper was able to clearly identify the the journalists. So for me, everything is, for me and for every other person who believes in this case and who continues to support our family, it's very clear that the facts are there, everything is there from day one. Yet the US administration continues to turn a blind eye. They continue to sweep to try to sweep this case under the rug. And most importantly, they're trying to time and time again adopt the Israeli army, Israeli government's narrative. That's why I'm sure Shireen would have asked them, what are you going to do differently now from before? How are you going to change this system? How are you going to hold the perpetrators accountable? Because Shireen wasn't the first American to be killed this year alone. Few months before that, Omar was killed, and no one was held accountable. And that is the reason why Shireen was killed, because of the lack of accountability and the continuous impunity that Israel enjoys. So for us, we're trying all our avenues, and I'm sure Shireen would have done the same. She would have tried to knock on every single door. She would have continuously fought for justice and accountability, because this is what she used to do. She used to use her voice, use her message to try to change the system by just conveying the truth and doing her job as a journalist. Yet she was still targeted, she was still killed. And for those of you who don't know, today my family submitted the file at the ICC along with the journalists, the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate. And this is a big step for us. And it just shows that because the US continues to ignore this case, because they continue to fail to hold the Israeli soldiers accountable and to continue to cover up for Israel's crimes and fail to answer a lot of the questions that not just us, but also their senators, congress members, and legislators have continued to raise time and time again. It's important that an international tribunal takes this case and investigates it further, since it amounts to a war crime. And honestly, it's just been very frustrating how the administration until today hasn't even answered any of the questions regarding if any US weapons were used, if any US taxpayer money went into the killing of my aunt. And this is an important, these are important questions that wasn't just raised by our family, but also, as I mentioned, by members of Congress and senators. And we saw a few weeks ago, Senator Van Hollen was continuing to pressure the administration, and Senator Leahy was questioning the entire statements of the US and Israel, and calling for the importance of an investigation. And if there isn't any, then we need to explore the option of imposing the Leahy law. So these are important moments, and I believe that when there's continuous pressure on the administration, when there's continuous mobilizing to call for justice and accountability, then we have a chance in shifting the narrative and shifting this entire policy and causing the change. And that's honestly what keeps me going, is the optimism of my aunt, because she would have done the same. She would have been optimistic. She would have seen the light at the end of the tunnel. So I will carry on that optimism from her and continue this fight along with the support of many Palestinians and many people abroad, and most importantly, um, policymakers and legislators who have the power, who have the authority to influence the administration.
Thank you so much, Lina. I can only imagine, I admire your optimism because I can only imagine how frustrating it is to constantly speak to an entire, the entire world, let alone the US, as an entity, and try to prove to them something that has already been proven. I would argue that not only Palestinian supporters or supporters of your late aunt are the ones who can see the facts, but the facts are clear to anybody, whether they want
Yes.
to admit it or not. And so I genuinely admire you and I'm sure that everybody else does, for your continuous efforts. And I think the murder of your aunt is proof of the precedent that the US has set for Israel and not holding them accountable. And this is a time where, the whole world is really watching and seeing, are they going to continue the precedent or not? So thank you again.
Thank you.
Diana, question for you. Are Palestinians on the ground hopeful that real change can be achieved and that Israel can actually be held accountable for its ongoing crimes?
It's a great question, Ayah. Before I begin, I want to say a few things. First, I want to say thank you to AJP for hosting this event. Thanks for these days of action. I think it's very, very, very important. Thanks to everybody who is attending and to those who've organized. And especially, it's really an honor to be with my friends, Lina Akleh and Josh Ruebner, and of course you, Ayah. I really think this is a wonderful panel, so I thank you for putting it together. Before I answer the question, I want to just say a quick word about something that, a quick word about Lina, actually. Shireen Akleh, we were blessed with somebody as gracious, as smart, as talented as Shireen Akleh. And she left behind an incredible legacy, not only in terms of journalism, but in terms of compassion and showing journalists how it's done, how it is that you can hear from those whose voices have been not only unheard, but have been deliberately silenced. And she carried such grace and poise in all of her reporting. We were blessed with her, and now we're blessed to have Lina and her family who are continuing this struggle. It's very easy to look the other way and to just throw your hands up and say that there will never be justice. It's the easier path. It's a difficult path. It's hard to swallow, but it's the easier path. And yet, what we've seen since Shireen's assassination on May the 12th of this year is that the Akleh family is not giving up. And not only are they not giving up, but it's also fueled many people to say, well, maybe we should also be trying to push for accountability for other cases as well. And I say this because if you look back at January of this year, with the killing of an 80-year-old man, Omar Assaad. Omar Assaad was killed in circumstances that in many ways were just unthinkable and unfathomable. And the cruelty with which he was murdered is, I still can't wrap my head around it. He was at 3 o'clock in the morning, stopped at an Israeli, what did they call it? Pop-up checkpoint, a flash checkpoint. And then dragged from his car at 3 o'clock in the morning on the coldest night of the year in January. He was dragged so much so that one of his shoes was left behind in his car as they dragged this 80-year-old man to a construction site where they shackled his arms and left him out to freeze. Now, I can't imagine doing that to another human being in any way, in any shape or form. None of us can. And yet, when it comes to the Israeli army, their way of behavior has become so commonplace. And when Omar Assaad was killed, there's always a part of you as a Palestinian that says, this is it, for sure, this is now going to be the wake-up call to the world to see the brutality of this Israeli military machine. And yet his death came and went. And it was a blip in the news for about a day, with the Americans making just a tiny little bit of noise. And that was it. And so if you ask me how it is that people on the ground, how it is that they're feeling, it's a mix of things. Because on the one hand, we see that this isn't just a question of turning a blind eye. This is not just the Americans turning a blind eye. This is funding and fueling and giving more money to this murderous machine. And so on the one hand, we see that Palestinians see the connection between the United States and between Israel. We see that without the US support, that Israel wouldn't be able to carry its acts freely, that there would be some pressure put on it. And yet, on the other hand, there's also this sense of optimism and a sense of real kind of an optimism that we must continue to try. We must continue to press forward. And one thing that I think is very important that has emerged from Shireen's case is that you just see how in lockstep all of the other countries around the world are when it comes to what it is that the US is doing. For example, the EU has already said that they're not going to be pushing for an investigation. And the way that the Israelis have behaved, they know precisely who the soldier is who killed Shireen Abu Akleh. And they're behaving as though this is somehow some petulant child who didn't mean to murder, didn't mean to assassinate her, when we know that the truth is otherwise. So in terms of where people believe, it's that we firmly understand the connection between the United States and between Israel, and the connection between the money that goes to from the United States to Israel, money that will not stop even with the killing of, even with the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh. We understand that, and yet there's still a sense that we must continue to push and must continue to try. And whether it's going to the ICC, which I'm very happy to hear is happening today, or going to other fora, people continue to demand that there be some form of accountability.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I would agree that, the US is simply not an ally anymore. In their complicity, I would argue that they've become more of a partner of apartheid. To continuously see countless facts in front of them of occupation, settler colonialism, and on top of that, not only the murder of Palestinians on the ground, but Palestinian Americans who hold US citizenship and should be protected by US law, and to, turn not necessarily a blind eye, but to quite literally ignore it and reward Israel is to be a partner and to be complicit. Next, I will have a question for Josh. What opportunities do you see with the new Congress to shift the conversation on Palestine?
Thanks so much, Ayah, and thanks so much to AJP Action for organizing this important event and inviting me to speak among such esteemed colleagues. I really echo Diana's comments about that and really applaud Lina for all of the strength and the dignity with which she's been conducting this quest for justice and accountability for her aunt these last 4 months, and to let her know that we're going to continue to do whatever it takes to continue the fight for justice and accountability for Shireen's killing. And that's a really important thing to talk about when we talk about holding Israel accountable, which is the theme of this conversation. It's important to note that when we demand that Israel be held accountable by the United States, that we're not asking for any special favors, but we're demanding that politicians uphold their constitutional duties to follow and implement the laws of the land. Now, under any reasonable interpretation of US law, accountability should mean, first and foremost, that Israel should not be receiving any form of US assistance from the United States. Let me tell you what I'm talking about here. The Foreign Assistance Act governs all forms of US assistance abroad. And it says that the goal of US policy is, quote, to promote and encourage increased respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms throughout the world without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. So toward that end of promoting human rights as a central component of US foreign policy, US law says the following, quote, no security assistance may be provided to any country, the government of which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. So under the terms of the Foreign Assistance Act, Israel should not be receiving any US weapons. Full stop. End of discussion. But even if politicians want to ignore this law, there are also others in place to hold Israel accountable too. For example, the Arms Export Control Act limits the use of US weapons to internal security and legitimate self-defense, as well as a few other very narrow uses, such as collective security pacts that have no applicability to Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people. What happens if you violate the Arms Export Control Act? When you violate this law, the result is that the United States is supposed to cut off all weapons to that country. So can we say that after 75 years of settler colonialism, 75 years of apartheid, 75 years of the dispossession of the Palestinian people and the refusal on Israel's part to agree to allow Palestine refugees to return to their homes, as is their guaranteed right under international law? Can we say that after 55 years of a brutal military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including a more than 15-year blockade of the Gaza Strip, including daily atrocities against Palestinian civilians, killing and injuring of civilians, demolition of homes, uprooting of agriculture and infrastructure? Can we say that any of this constitutes internal security or legitimate self-defense on the part of Israel? I think the answers to these questions are self-evident. But even if these laws are not applied globally, and specifically in the case of Israel, we can still demand accountability for individual units of the Israeli military that have committed atrocities. So the Leahy laws, which are part of the Foreign Assistance Act, mandate a cutoff of equipment and training to any military unit that commits a gross human rights violation when that country refuses to hold the perpetrator accountable. And this is why Senator Leahy himself said, very importantly, on the Senate floor last week, that if Israel's killing of Shireen Abu Akleh was intentional, and if Israel continues its irresponsibility in terms of refusing to prosecute that soldier, then the Leahy law would apply and sanctions would need to be implemented. So let's be very clear. When we demand that Israel be held accountable for its actions, we have US law on our side. And when our politicians fail to hold Israel accountable, not only are they failing to uphold US law, but they're holding Israel to a lower standard than other countries and exceptionalizing it in the process. Shouldn't all countries be held to the same human rights standards that the US claims to uphold? Doesn't the failure to hold Israel accountable only embolden its sense of impunity, thereby strengthening its oppression of the Palestinian people? I think that the answer to these questions are also self-evident. So when I consider your question, Ayah, and the possibilities for what we can do to move this Congress and the next Congress forward in terms of supporting Palestinian rights, I'm really very heartened by the fact that we have in Congress this growing block of members of Congress who are pushing to hold Israel accountable, some of whom we heard from earlier today. And it's incredibly important to note that this Congress, we've seen an unprecedented number of initiatives to actually hold Israel accountable. Representative Betty McCollum's bill, H.R. 2590, to prevent U.S. funding for Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes. It's jailing and mistreatment of Palestinian children in military courts. It's annexation of Palestinian lands. We saw how AOC and Bernie introduced a historic joint resolution last year. The first time ever, Congress tried to prohibit the delivery of a specific weapon system to Israel. We heard and saw about how Representative Carson is introducing his Justice for Shireen Act. And also in regards to what Deanna was talking about, Omar Assad's tragic murder by Israeli soldiers, we saw how Senator Tammy Baldwin and Representative Gwen Moore, who represented him in Congress, demanded a U.S. investigation into his killing. These are just a few of many examples that exist. But as Dr. Osama mentioned earlier, it's certainly not all roses. The Israel lobby is clearly threatened by the rise of this progressive bloc of members of Congress who are challenging the lack of accountability for Israel's atrocities against Palestinians. It's important to note that in this electoral cycle, United Democracy Project, which is the super PAC of AIPAC, along with the Democratic Majority for Israel, contributed more than $30 million into these primaries to try to defeat progressives and attempt to try to prevent this block of progressive support for Palestinian rights from growing in Congress. It's astonishing to realize that this makes up about 30% of all spending in this year's primaries. So in many cases, the AIPAC-backed candidates won, but in other cases, we saw races where we have good reason to believe that we're actually going to see an increase in the number of members of Congress next year who are supportive of Palestinian rights. And so this is where I see optimism, and this is where I see opportunity in growing this block of supportive members of Congress, and in you continuing to do the important work that you're doing in making sure that we are advocating constantly with these members of Congress to ensure that they hold Israel accountable.
Thanks so much, Josh. I think everything that you said leads to one big lesson, especially ending with the amount of money that AIPAC spent on, the elections, and it's that we need to do better at taking control of our narrative, and that's in, everybody taking a stand and everybody being consistent and not just leaving it to just advocates and activists and like organizations like ours, but everyday people. We had earlier Ariel from Google, who was with a group of people that, got fired for standing up for what's right. But these kinds of things are what are going to set a precedent of what we can and cannot accept, whether it's in US government or corporations. And essentially, these members of Congress or state government or federal government work for us as Americans. We've hired them. And so we need to continuously show them what we care about and that our narrative matters too, and our experiences matter too. And so I think, going into the new Congress, especially with new members, we need to set a precedent of actively being within the halls of Congress and government, generally speaking. So the three of you have already kind of touched on this in different ways, but a final question for all of you, and we can start with Lina answering, is since the Biden administration refuses to budge, what other avenues of accountability exist that can be utilized?
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the examples we used today was one of the things we did today was the ICC. It's a very important avenue because, as I said, international tribunals are created when governments are unwilling and when they're unwilling to investigate their own crimes. And at this point, as I've been saying since day one, war criminals cannot be investigating their own crimes. So it's really important that the ICC takes this up with the same excitement they would if this was in another country, under another government, or under another army. So it's really important that we see the ICC actually investigating, even though we all know the truth, we all know the facts. So that is one avenue. And other avenues is honestly just continuing to push for the administration. We still call on President Biden to accept our requests and demands to meet with our family, to hear from us directly, because that's important for us as a family to see that he's actually interested in he's actually there and supporting our family. But for the past months now, we've seen that that's not the case, unfortunately. But I think just continuing to push and press on the administration through any and all avenues available to us is important. And members of Congress, I think, would be a perfect example for that, where we continue to advocate for them in campaign that at the end of the day, Shireen was a US citizen, she was a Palestinian American, she was a journalist, and she was a human being who was killed while exercising her rights to press. And these are some of the values that the US continues to preach, such especially President Biden. So holding the administration accountable and calling them out for their hypocrisy is one of the many ways that we'll continue to push. And lastly, we will seek accountability and justice, no matter where that takes us, and no matter, we will use any and all options available to us to make sure that we will have justice, regardless of how long that's going to take us.
Thank you so much, Lina. Consistency is absolutely key in this situation. Diana.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Lina said, and just to add a few more. You know, I think that there are also avenues that are in the United States that are available as well, and I think that those are avenues that we shouldn't be closing our eye to. I want to make sure that people understand that that there was a push for the Israelis to investigate themselves. And they conducted what we think is what they call an investigation, which was really just a PR method of closing Shireen's file. And the reason that they conducted this investigation was because there was pressure, there was sustained pressure on Israel to do so. And the results that they came out with were exactly what was expected, which is that they will forever try to shield their soldiers and try to make sure that there is a total block of impunity. This is why the soldier's name has never been published, even though they know precisely who that soldier is. And I'm sure they know who gave the orders to that soldier to assassinate Shireen. I say this because when we talk about accountability, this isn't just about accountability for the killing of Palestinian Americans. It's not just the accountability for one person or for two people, the two Palestinian Americans who've been killed this year, but it's accountability for the entire system that has been allowed to fester for all of these years, for 7.5 decades. And that's what we talk about when we talk about accountability. This isn't just looking for one particular soldier and putting that one particular soldier and sanctioning that one particular soldier, but it's about the system. And that's the part that is the most important for me, is that they've turned this somehow into just about one individual, one issue, and it's not. It's much bigger than that. As I've said over and over again, if the Israeli army had not been in Jenin, Shireen would not have been in Jenin. In other words, had the Israeli army not been invading and attacking Jenin, there would have been no reason for Shireen Abu Akleh to have been in Jenin. And it's the connection of the occupation and what Israel's doing. That's the system that needs to be held accountable. It's not about one individual or one individual who's assassinated or two who've been assassinated or however many. It's about the system that's been allowed to fester for all of these years. And for that, we need to expand our horizons a little bit more. Lina obviously spoke about the ICC when it comes to that particular case. And I think that there's many more avenues that we need to be pursuing as well to make sure that this entire system is brought to account.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Diana. I think sometimes when we bring certain issues or one example of the bigger picture, policymakers or, just elected officials generally might just latch onto that one thing, but refuse to look at the bigger picture of, the ongoing system of apartheid that's harming thousands of people, and we're being complicit within that. So it really isn't just about one issue. Josh.
Yeah, I think in life, as an advocacy, you never necessarily know the impact that your actions are going to have. You don't know what the repercussions will be. You don't know what the ripple effects of your words and the actions that you take will be. So we don't always know if we're having an impact while we're in the midst of the campaign to try to get justice or accountability. And sometimes we don't know for a long time. Sometimes we won't know for 30 years until the historical archives open whether we've actually had an impact on the policy or not. So given that we don't know the all of the outcomes of our efforts, and given the fact that we're all tremendously disappointed, to use an extremely weak word, at the Biden administration's policy over the last 2 years. I mean, for real, the Biden administration has not even taken basic, simple steps that it pledged to do before the election 2 years ago to reopen the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. They pledged to do that, and they still haven't done that, much less hold Israel accountable for its apartheid. So we know that that's the case. But look how our advocacy builds. Diana mentioned the case of Omar Assaad earlier. Just a few weeks ago, there was a newspaper report in Haaretz stating that the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem was now opening a file on the military unit that killed Omar. That to me indicates that there's a possibility, and a strong possibility, of a Leahy law investigation being underway, potentially leading to a small amount of accountability in this instance. Now that process, just to get there, took 7 or 8 months, and we still haven't gotten to accountability and justice yet. So we don't know yet what the ultimate outcome and impact of Lina's advocacy is going to be, of all our advocacy is going to be. And so when we think about that and we don't know for sure what the outcome is, what are our two choices? To continue or to quit? And if we quit, for sure, we will not achieve accountability and justice. But if we pursue and we persevere and we continue in this effort, we might get there. And I'm confident that we will get there.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Josh. I think much of what we've seen in the last 2 years proves that we are making progress through our advocacy and our consistency. I don't think, that just 5 years ago, we would see certain members of Congress speak out as much as they had on the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, or we wouldn't have seen legislation like Representative Betty McCollum's HR 2590, and, we wouldn't have seen members of Congress outright stand up and be like, I support Palestinian human rights. Up until a few years ago, that was something that was pretty much shunned within US politics. And so I think despite the long road we have ahead of us, and despite the fact that it seems hopeless at times, I do think that there is a lot of hope within our consistency. But I also do believe that it really does take a village, and it takes, continual binding efforts to achieve our end goal. And with that, I think it's very crucial that we don't just hone in on one issue. Omar, Assaad, and Shireen Akleh were killed by two different units. So just holding the unit accountable is not efficient enough. We need to hold the whole system accountable that has continued to cause this. And, the extension of the system is the US government for being complicit within these crimes continuously. And so it really is a duty upon us as Americans to be consistent in our efforts and to not let it slide. Oftentimes when I am meeting with staffers or members of Congress, they'll tell me stories of how, they have Zionist organizations or Zionist constituents that are in their offices having meetings with them countless times a month. And if there's 6 Zionists speaking to a member of Congress every month compared to 1 or 2 Palestinians, they are going to win. They are going to speak over us and shun our voices. And so that's why we need to take our narrative and be consistent and show them that we exist too, and we belong to be heard, and we belong, or we deserve to gain justice and not have to beg for them to see what's very clear, like Lina had said, the clear facts. So thank you all again so much today for being with us. I know you have very busy schedules, and I admire all of the work that the 3 of you continuously do. I know it's not easy, and I hope that all of our viewers got something from this session as well as the rest of the sessions. And I hope that the biggest thing you got is to not lose hope, especially within US government, and to hold weight to your efforts, because they really do matter. With that being said, this ends our sessions for today. For those of you who are joining us for the rest of Advocacy Week, your meetings will start tomorrow, so I hope that you take everything that has been said from all 3 of our panels and apply that within your meetings. Thank you all so much for being here, and I hope that we continue to fight for a free Palestine.
Thank you, Ayah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Lina. Thank Josh.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you all.
Okay.